Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us tonight for EcoQuestions. So this session is being recorded, and we ask that everyone remain muted until it's time for our Q&A. Feel free to type questions into the chat, like I mentioned earlier, and everyone who has registered for this session will receive this recording in their email, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel. For those of you who are not familiar with the Metro Phoenix EcoFlora, we're a community science project that is documenting urban biodiversity using a free web-based platform and app called iNaturalist. So each month we have a new EcoQuest, and this month we're focusing on nocturnal pollinators, trying to escape the heat a little bit. So tonight we have Dr. Katy Prudic, the Assistant Professor of Citizen and Data Science at the School of Natural Resources at the University of Arizona. She is an entomologist interested in discovering how ecological and evolutionary interactions promote biodiversity and how they can inform conservation decision-making. Her discoveries have been published in Science, Proceedings of the National Academy, Proceedings of the Royal Society B, and Behavioral Ecology, and covered by Associated Press, BBC, CBC, National Geographic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Welcome, Katy. I'll stop sharing my screen, and it's all yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Jenny. I am very excited to be here and I appreciate the invitation. So I'm going to take a moment and share my screen. Oh, it's disabled, Jenny.
Okay, give me 1 second.
And then we have somebody in the audio who can't hear, or somebody in the chat who can't hear audio. Can anybody else hear audio, or can people hear us?
If you can hear us, give us a thumbs up or in the chat. Okay, we had this issue last time. Dee Dee, if you exit and then re-enter, we'll see if that fixes the problem.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. And we're going to get started here. Yeah, so folks, today we're going to be talking about nocturnal pollinators, which I named my presentation, The Dark Night of the Pollinators. Before we get started on that, I just want us all to take a moment and wish each other Happy Pollinator Week. Pollinator Week, if you're not familiar, is an annual event celebrated internationally in support of pollinator health. You can get connected online, but using the hashtags hashtag Pollinator Week or hashtag Power and Pollinators. To those ends, though, too, I also recommend this week that you hug your favorite pollinator or plant something they can eat or drink, just in solidarity with our pollinator friends. So I just wanted to recap a little bit about, before we get into nocturnal pollination, I just wanted to recap on what pollinators are, what they do, and why they're important. Again, pollinators are responsible for 1 out of 3 bites of your food. Fundamentally, pollinators help create baby plants. Without them, many plants, specifically in the group we call the flowering plants, would go extinct. And as a result of that, many animals would go hungry, including humans, and of course, the domesticated animals we raise to eat. So besides, helping to create baby plants, pollinators provide other ecosystem services or eco-services. What I mean by that is they help different parts of the ecosystem function, and those include eating all of the decaying matter like you get from maggots and grubs, or they may help move carbon and nitrogen through an ecosystem, such as what predators do by consuming prey, or as caterpillars, which I love to call nature's hot dogs, they consume plants and are food for birds, lizards, and mammals. So again, moving that carbon and nitrogen through a system. So pollinators are really important, and they're pretty cool too. So pollination itself is old. It's about 300 million years old, and this was just as terrestrial biology was starting to take off. So things are starting to crawl out of the ocean. At this time, seeds are evolving. And then also other key innovations during this time was the amniote egg. Even though turtles had not evolved yet, their ancestors had, which used the amniote egg. And then another key invention was wood digesting fungus. So all that wood that was growing on land now could be broken down into other materials that could be used by other organisms. So really cool things. It's very old. It's an interaction between plants, and at first it was an interaction between plants and insects, and then that gradually moved out to other taxa as they came on the scenes. So pollinators today come in many animal flavors, and the big ones are insects, birds, and occasionally mammals. And there are even some examples of a few reptiles pollinating flowers, especially in the tropics. But truth be told, insect pollinators are the big contributors. Now, they come in what I call the big four, and you may be familiar with those. And those are insects that have complete development, and those are beetles, flies, ants, bees, and wasps, and then butterflies and moths. And so their scientific sort of names are Coleoptera, Diptera, Hymenoptera, and Lepidoptera. And you notice here I put like the number of species we have estimated for each of those groups. And then you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner how those might compare to the vertebrates we all know and love, and then also plants. So there's a lot of insects out there. So they might not make up in volume or size. They certainly make up in number. So just a little bit of background thinking about this is pollinators work really hard. Plants work really hard to keep their pollinators. They provide nectar and pollen rewards. So they attract or they reward pollinators for coming and visiting through sugar and fat and protein. They also often will provide some garish displays to attract attention and increase memory retention among their pollinators. So they keep coming back and keep enjoying the experience of visiting a flower. Now, plants aren't above using drugs to entice their pollinators. So both nectar and pollen actually have addictive substances such as caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. So just keep that in mind when next time you smell the rose on the side of the road. Plants provide a lot of things for pollinators, and they do a couple little tricky things to keep them coming back, but they also tolerate a lot of pollinator shenanigans. So I'm just going to give you some examples. Is pollinators aren't exactly always on the straight and narrow here. So for honeybees, they often eat more pollen than they actually transfer. So they collect pollen and then feed it to other members of their hive or to including their babies. Carpenter bees, which you will see occasionally around town, will steal nectar without transferring pollen. So they'll actually, as you see here in the center photograph, they are chewing through the flower, circumventing the pollen granules and just sucking up the nectar. And then hawk moths, such as the genus Manduca, lay eggs on the plants they pollinate. So plants have to put up with, of course, being chewed on in addition to having their gametes transferred. So with all these sort of interactions and varying costs and benefits between plants and pollinators, pollinators quickly through time adapt to their plants. And so you'll get things like really long mouth parts that only fit into certain plants and not others, seen on your left. There's also different sort of acquisition of pollen adaptation. So something buzz pollination is something I always refer to that. And that is where bumblebees commonly do this, but other solitary bees do this as well. Well, they'll dislocate the muscles that attach between their exoskeleton and their wings and vibrate those muscles super fast, and that shakes the pollen loose. And then they'll reattach those muscles when they have to fly again. So pretty cool little tricks that everybody's getting or evolving to get nectar and pollen. So some things to think about, and you've probably heard this recently in the news, but I just wanted to touch on this, is that insects, and especially pollinators and aquatics, are declining. Insects receive the least animal funding for conservation, management, and restoration. And another challenge with this too, in terms of a management and conservation perspective, is not just resourcing, but also in the rules. insects are weirdly assigned to different areas. For example, in California, insects are lumped with fish. So a lot of the regulatory processes and management policies are so same ones that are applied to fish. But you can imagine a bee does not have the same requirements as a fish does. So those are some of the challenges. But I want to say that can have impacts on other systems. I'm not one of those people that think that insects' declines are necessarily going to lead to insect mass extinction, because there's so many of them. But it is going to have huge impacts on flowering plants and insectivores, such as birds and other small mammals that depend on these insects for large amounts of these insects for food. So as those insects decline, there's going to be impacts in the other parts of the ecosystem. So the good news, though, is that there's new pollinator conservation opportunities just emerging very quickly and have huge importance in a variety of sectors that normally wouldn't have really thought as pollinator conservation places. And those include agriculture, suburban wildlands, and urban public gardens. So when we think about most pollination, we think about it happening during the day, and that's partly because we're mostly a diurnal species, so we like to be out and about in the day. And to those ends, like pollination in the day is very visual. So plants produce these really beautiful flowers that are bright and colorful. They're often reflecting the UV as well as the visual range, and they couple them with fancy perfumes that the insects and other pollinators can both smell and taste. And this helps with them finding and remembering those flowers. But when we look, we know that some pollination happens at night. And we know this by certain flower morphologies. But it turns out that pollination at night is very similar to pollination in the day. So the flowers, again, have to be highly contrasting and bright. So in a nighttime environment, they are usually pale to increase the luminous contrast with the dark background. And of course, the perfume still matters. So the way that the animals find the plants and remember them is still basically the same as it works in the daytime. And I just want to remind yourself, folks out there, that moonlight in particular is just a reflection of sunlight. So it has the same spectral properties as sunlight. So again, the UV and visual ranges are really important for signaling between plant and pollinator. But again, those signals are often dimmer because it is a reflection. So things like luminous, contrast, or brightness are really important. So that's why you see a lot of white or pale flowers. When we look in the literature, we find that night pollination is common in places where nights are hot. And there seem to be two reasons why this happens. Daytime temperatures are often too hot for some insects and mammals, and in particular, and sometimes birds. Also, daytime temps are too hot for plants to breathe, basically, and create energy without becoming massively dehydrated. So they basically, when it's just too hot out, like the Sonoran Desert last week when the sun was trying to kill us, then you would expect to see more nighttime pollination. Now, when we look at who the pollinators are in a nocturnal framework, they're actually a little different than who is going to be around versus a diurnal framework. And so for nighttime pollination, bats are really common, as are moths. Those are our two big groups that have been the most well studied. So when we think about bats, and I heard from Jenny that there was a recent talk on bats, and I am an entomologist by training, and so I don't know a lot about bats. So this is pretty much sums up what I know in the next couple slides. There's about 7 good pollinators in the Sonoran Desert of bat species, while there's about 1,000 good pollinators of moths in the Sonoran Desert. And so just something to think about is that, our little moth friends are pretty common pollinators. To be fair, though, nocturnal pollination is super understudied, and that again speaks to our sort of proclivities to be active when it's light out. And it's also about how we study pollination. So bees are given for good or for ill, and it's not clear yet whether they deserve this moniker or not, but they are considered the super pollinators. And that is because they collect pollen specifically to eat versus other pollinators who often are more accidental. They're there for the nectar, but maybe not the pollen. And so we tend to focus a lot on bees. And we also, complicated in that is the domesticated bee, the honeybee, I often refer to it as a cow bee, is incredibly well studied for agriculture purposes. There's a whole domestication that happened. It's important for agriculture industry. So again, not bad. It's just we have a very narrow view maybe of how nocturnal pollination works. When we look, it seems to be important. And again, these aren't as well studied as diurnal pollination. But here's kind of the take-home message with what we know so far is moths and bats are both really important. They visit not just the same species that bees visit, but other species as well. And they seem to be pretty good at transferring pollen when we look. And that basically has to do with all you can see here in both the moth on your left and the bat on your right is they're kind of messy eaters. They get pollen everywhere. They've got all these hairs and it just sticks to them. And so they kind of just move pollen, maybe less distinctly than bees do, but they definitely move it around. And that's because of their hygiene habits more than anything, or lack thereof. Moths, as we discussed before, there are many. Bats are fewer, but they do eat a lot. So they do a lot of visitation. One of the things that separates out nocturnal pollinators potentially from diurnal ones is because of their identity, they tend to carry pollen over greater distances. So they might be really important for systems where you want what we call outbreeding. So you want to move those gametes to a greater distance to increase genetic diversity. And that has to do with bees tend to be little homebodies. If you're a honeybee, you've got a hive you've got to stay close to. If you're a solitary bee, you've got a nest that you're working on and you've got to stay close to. So they don't move as great a distances as moths and bats. Now, when we step into the moth world, there's a lot. And I just want people to remember that. And they're really cool. So if you're interested, I highly recommend it. There's about 1,000 moth pollinators in the Sonoran, give or take. It's hard to get an exact number because they're hard to identify. Some of them are, and there's a lot of them. And nobody's really gone through and sort of systematically addressed who's a pollinator and who hasn't. Moths come in many shapes and sizes. Some are big, some are little, some are in between. And they all eat plants just like butterflies do. And some are pretty voracious. I know probably some people have had some moth problems like the tobacco hornworm or something, the tomato hornworm eating parts of their garden. But if you have a moth you'd like to get ID'd, I do recommend the University of Arizona has an insect identification, and I'll make sure that Jenny gets the slideshow again so people can link to that. And you can send in a picture that we might be able to identify for you. So the big moth contributors to pollination, there's the big four, again, that I tend to think of. Those are hawk moths, or in the family Sphingidae, or silkworm moths, Saturniidae, owlet moths, Noctuidae, and the geometer, or the inchworm moth in the Geometridae. If you're interested on following good social media about all these moth pollinators in the Sonoran Desert, I find that Spadefoot Nursery has some really fun things, especially on Instagram, that could be help you just get more familiar with all of our tiny neighbors in our gardens and beyond. As we study more pollination, especially in urban areas like you guys are doing, we're probably going to find more moth groups that could be important pollinators. And here's a few examples: the tiger moth, the snout moth, the yucca moth, and the burnet moth. All of those I would expect. And again, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of learning more about moths, another place to go is a website run by Professor Bruce Walsh at the University of Arizona. He's got a longstanding website on the southeast, the moths of Southeast Arizona. So feel free to check that out if you want to get into mothing. As we learn more, I think other things are going to pop out too. I mean, as nocturnal pollinators, we've talked a lot about moths. and some bats, but again, we're not really looking. We're spending a lot of time looking for bees during the day. And so other things that come to mind is certainly when I've been out in the field at night are beetles, flies, ants are probably a big one. And then a lot of the teeny tiny things like here we have a thrip, which until recently wasn't thought to be a pollinator, but actually turns out to be an important one for cacao. So, you know, hope springs eternal. You'll always find things you never thought you would. So to those ends, you know, as we think moving forward, the threats to nocturnal pollinators are serious, just like they are to diurnal pollinators. There is an ongoing problem with habitat loss, but probably more important in the West is this combination of extreme heat with increasing aridity. And that seems to be a problem with butterflies, and it would not shock me at all if it's also a problem in other insects. So, and the timing of that heat and aridity or dryness is particularly detrimental in August and September. And I imagine this will continue to be a big problem. And that is as the moths are preparing to overwinter, they need resources to help them prepare for hibernation, basically. And so having stuff around that's blooming is really important then. So to those ends, here are some ideas to help our little nocturnal moth friends. And those include, when you think about creating habitat in your yard, to not only think about your diurnal pollinators, but also your nocturnal ones. So you're going to want flowers that bloom at night. And then also thinking about flowers that not only just bloom at night, but bloom in August, September, and October, such as this Jimson weed on the right. Know too, though, that a lot of things that provide blooms also provide food for caterpillars. So your plants will probably get chewed on in a good way. You're helping. And then another thing to devote energy to would be to enhance urban and suburban spaces for pollinators, and that includes nocturnal pollinators. So thinking about areas that interface with wildlife and suburban, that interface is really important, and making sure there is food there for our nocturnal pollinators in addition to our diurnal ones. And then thinking about how to plant pollinator food in parks, public gardens, and even campuses such as ASU or the University of Arizona. And again, when you're thinking about this and helping to participate in these ventures, think about not just the nectar resources or the host plant resources, but think about water sources and roosts for not just bats, but moths and butterflies also need roosts at night that are above ground so they don't quite get eaten by predators or get too hot. In your daily practice, I also ask people to use insecticides wisely. Use targeted insecticides only when needed, and then adopt other pest management practices, as this dog is doing an excellent job of disrupting water against mosquitoes. Think of other physical ways that might help deter pest insects. And of course, always reach out to your extension agents. In this case, we've got Dawn Gouge up there in Maricopa County, and she's excellent to help you think about other ways to manage your pests locally. And of course, as you folks know, another thing you can do is record what you find in a community science platform. You folks are using iNaturalist, which is fabulous. I use that certainly in my research. It's wonderful to have those contributions. Other places that you might be able to contribute, depending on what you're finding, include Nature's Notebook, which is looking at the seasonality or what animals are doing and plants are doing where and when. And then, of course, there's ebird for birds, and then ebutterfly for butterflies. And then final thing that I think I always encourage people to do is to bug your politicians about pollinator conservation, including nocturnal pollinators. Again, as we discussed earlier, 1 in 3 bites of your food are courtesy of pollinators. So you can imagine what would happen to your food prices if we have to resort to humans pollinating plants like you see here. This is becoming more common in China at the moment as their pollinators decline. And just to put this into context, too, 70 of the top 100 crops we use in the United States need pollinators. And it's about 90% of our farm nutrients for us and for the animals that eat feed. So it's important. It's a big part of the food chain that we consume. So it's not a small issue. Anyways, I'd love to take questions, chat with you more. I can be reached in a variety of ways, and I think Jenny's going to put those in the chat. And then also, it's pretty easy to find me on the U of A website. So it's a nice thing having a unique last name. So I'd love to take questions and stop share.
Thank you so much, Katie. Really, really, really great information. We'll move right into our Q&A, like you said, and we have one question in the chat right now. Do you happen to have a plant list available for nocturnal pollinators?
Yeah, okay, so that's always like local, right? Where can I ask where there are? Are they in, oh my gosh, can't keep track of this. If you're in sort of like the Phoenix area, I'm just going to assume you're in the Sonoran Desert. Does that sound good? I like Oenothera. That's a great one. There's a couple different flavors of Oenothera. Evening primrose, I think, is the common name. Jenny, back me up on this. Is this great? I'm an entomologist, I'm in California. Okay, cool. What part of California? What do we got, Dee Dee? Are you in the desert? Are you somewhere else?
It's a big difference in northern and southern.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think Central Valley. Okay, cool. Yeah, so in general, like I think you're still going to see Oenothera should still do well where you're at. I always go to sort of local nurseries to help with that, but you're looking for flowers that kind of have that. When you saw pictures of that, white bowl shape, so it's sort of like really easy to see. Other ones, there's some cactuses, but they're not as frequent bloomers. Jimson weed, I've seen that on the roadways in the Central Valley. Again, it's sort of a weed, but gosh, it's a great weed. I think sometimes we don't give weeds enough credit. So many good things feed off of it. And it's pretty, actually. There are some squashes that bloom at night that could work depending on what you're doing. I agree, and it's native. Yes, I know. Some plants just don't get all the love. I find my milkweeds get visited a fair amount at night. Again, sometimes this sounds strange, but I do recommend it, is one night, maybe when you're suffering from insomnia, you just wander outside and see what's going on in your garden. That can be really helpful, just trying to figure out what actually your plants do at night while you're supposed to be sleeping. So that can be helpful. Yeah, so to me, it's sort of like I really like Oenothera, Jimson weed. Those are the ones I really fall back on when I lived in Davis. Jasmine was another good one. Not native, but really kind of a fun plant. So I feel like plants are always a personal choice too.
Yeah. I think you may have nicotiana out there also, like desert tobacco or coyote tobacco. I think that's
right. Yeah, exactly.
Which again is, not something I think you'll find in nurseries, but
yeah. And by all means, like I have, and I'm sure a few people in this audience as well, have collected seeds from like out either on a roadway or like national forest, and then taken just a few and then grown them up in my backyard and done that thing. So there are other options there. Yeah. And so, yeah, bird cage, Jeff is being helpful there. So he put something in there. And then somebody just asked what sphinx moths like. And I think we just touched on what sphinx moths. So those are also known as hawk moths. And around here and then further up north, we get the six-line sphinx moths is very common. It kind of looks like a little hummingbird, but it loves Oenothera. It loves Jimson weed. So it would probably eat your tomatoes or not eat your, but nectar off of your tomatoes. So yeah. Yeah, but I do, yeah, those are kind of things that came to mind.
Definitely with the primrose, they're all over that stuff.
Yeah.
You can see them up in Flagstaff doing that.
They'll be impatient sometimes, like, because they open like right as the sun is setting, and like they'll just come in and they'll just be like hitting it with a proboscis as it's opening, being like, "Come on, let me in,
They're
I'm
like,
hungry.
hello.
I need snacks."
That's funny. We need energy, please. I'm going to ask a question. In the very beginning of your slides, you said an amniote egg. Would you explain what
Yeah.
that means?
Yeah, so that is basically, the chicken egg is probably what you think of when you think of an amniote egg, but it is this innovation of an embryo, not having an animal embryo, not having to develop in water. So it is a hard, encased um, embryo, basically. And so that includes chickens, and there's reptiles and birds. So birds, mammals, like all mammals have amniotic. And then, when you move into placentals, like what we are, that the egg casing has gone away. We've gone into something called vivipary, which means that we develop our young internally, and other animals have done this too. And so you'll often lose that hard casing. But the genes that actually made that, I think, are still floating around in us. So they're around. But yeah, so that's the idea, is that it prevented the embryo from drying out when it didn't require water to develop.
Gotcha. Thank you. So you also mentioned moth and butterfly roosts. Can you give us an idea where we might be able to find those, or can we make them?
Yeah, and so for caterpillars, I'm always thinking. So I think about different life stages. Caterpillars, especially during the day, I like to give them space where they can crawl up somewhere. Sorry, my video was off. Come on, come back. Oh, why you're doing this? Anyways, so plants like grasses are really good so that the caterpillars can kind of get off that area really close to the ground where it's super hot. And the same is true for butterflies. They're going to want to kind of find a space where they can sleep. Basically, all insects sleep, whether it's in the day or the night, depending on when they're active. And that usually has to be a couple feet off the ground. It could be like a grass, it could be a perennial plant, something leafy, it could be a tree. But yeah, just think of it that way, is again, so maybe not, cutting back all of your grass all the time, right? So if you have a bunch grass, just let it keep going. If you don't deadhead everything immediately, maybe. I mean, just try to be cautious or careful with that, and try to balance that a little, to provide space for roosts. Yeah, that's what I would say. So I think some people, my neighbors, for example, yesterday had, they weed whacked everything, and that's not ideal for a butterfly.
Right. Or at least reducing, or extending the time between mowings, I think.
Exactly. And maybe if you cut back one plant, you leave one that's still available. So those sort of things, just
Balance.
Yeah. It also
So
means you can be lazy with your lawn care or in your yard care, which is great. I enjoy that.
especially in the heat.
Exactly. It's better for everybody. That's what I
Right.
tell my
Less
friends. It's like,
less stress for the plants, less stress for us, less stress for the
it's
pollinators. It's all good.
it's all good.
So we know honeybees are really, kind of harped on for agriculture and pollinator conservation, but do we have any idea, or is there any idea out there, how much native bees contribute to our food systems?
So it really does depend on the crop. So I think like squashes are almost entirely native bee pollinated. Something like alfalfa also has a lot of native bees that participate. Anything that is buzz pollinated would have to be a bumblebee. More than likely, there are a few other native bees that could do it, but not as many things have that ability to dislocate basically the muscles of their wings. So those are like solanaceous things. So peppers, tomatoes, those tend to be more um, bumblebee, like when you're doing an agriculture, like at scale. In my backyard, I have ants that help me with that. So they kind of crawl around the flowers and do that. But when you're talking about, having to meet, like having to feed large amounts of people, it's a little bit of a different ballgame.
That's
But
absolutely
yeah,
fascinating about the bumblebees and their wings. I just can't
I
get
know
over
it's
that
it's
fact.
it's sort of creepy too. You're like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute.
It's
You just
amazing.
unhook your muscles. Oh, that's just weird.
If anyone else has questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask verbally. In the meantime, I'll keep asking questions. So would you tell us a bit more about eButterfly and some of your work and, how important community science really is?
Yeah, I work on eButterfly, which is sort of it's an international collaboration between myself and a few folks. One of them, who's really the sort of lead on this, is Max Larrivee at the Space for Life in Montreal. So it's got a Canadian sort of flavor to it. And what it is it's a checklist system for citizen scientists who are, you know, going out and looking at multiple butterflies all at once, sort of like birders who do that. And so, yeah, and I think Andy Hogan was lurking at some point in here, and he's definitely a participant in eButterfly. And so, yeah, so he keeps track of your list and your photographs and helps you get identifications, and then the data is used for science. And this is true too with iNaturalist and eBird. There's a lot of pretty good publications coming out right now. And sometimes I will say that we haven't quite closed the loop on getting back to the people who have participated on what we're finding, if that makes sense. I think eBird is probably the best, and then we do okay in eButterfly, but I would say iNaturalist doesn't do a lot of it. So it's a little bit harder to figure out, like, what is my contribution doing? How am I sort of making, conservation, restoration, management better? I can tell you as an active scientist that, like, it's really helpful. Like, it's amazing. We're able to answer questions and look at scales and both temporal and spatial scales that we couldn't even 10 years ago. So it's really important what you're doing, and it's really appreciated, even though we may not communicate that as well as we should.
I absolutely second that. Try to make project members feel appreciated as much as possible.
It's
You're
so important. Yeah, and like, science unfortunately is a little bit of a hidden venture, I would say. If you're not sort of, behind the scenes actually seeing how it's done, it's sort of like, well, how does the magic happen? And it's hopefully we'll get better at sort of pulling back the curtains and showing people the bits of how that all happens. But
I was
yeah,
about to say the
so
wizard behind the curtain.
yeah, might be. I certainly don't feel like a wizard most days, but
Yeah.
okay.
So what
But
are
yeah,
you
no, it's go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I mean, it's again, like, I want to encourage people to, like, feel like they don't have to just contribute to one citizen science project. Is
Yes.
like, try them all out and see what, it might be some days you're like, I'm gonna do Nature's Notebook for 6 months and I really like it, and then don't feel bad about switching or adding another one. It's not like, the more you can do and the more you find joy in it, the better.
And it all helps.
Yeah.
All contributes. So what are you currently working on? Some of the
Oh
things.
yeah. Other things. So the things that, like, sort of are working on is we're looking at how um, the host plants, so what butterflies feed on, how their ranges have changed over the past 20 years, and how the butterflies' ranges have changed, maybe in response to that, or maybe they're responding to other things in climate change. So what we're trying to assess is how the last 20 years have affected both where plants are and where butterflies are, and thinking about how that might impact what we're doing with conservation and restoration. So, for example, like, is it a good idea to plant this milkweed here? Or is it actually not part of its range anymore? It used to be, but it may not do as well in these certain locations anymore. And as a result, the butterfly is really not around and those sorts of things. So that's kind of what I'm looking at, is the effects of climate change on where butterflies and their host plants are.
That's really fascinating. We've been having a lot of conversations about that too, and planting plants, what
Oh,
are
yeah.
we looking at and considering, is this going to be able to survive here in the next, even 5 to 10 years,
Right.
and what that looks like.
Yeah, and to those ends, like, we're starting to develop sort of predictive models or estimates of where we think they'll be in 20 or 50 years. And then we're trying to get people maybe to go out even now and see, like, well, maybe they're already moved there. Like, let's go ground truth this and see if they can go find this for us. So yeah, I hear you. It's tricky because it doesn't seem like the same rules are applying anymore.
Yeah. And quickly shifting.
Yeah. And we're not sure where. Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Does anyone want to unmute? I'll give a minute if you'd like to ask a question verbally. Give a couple seconds if anyone would like. No? All right. Well, I have one last question. What kind of a double question, I guess. What do you
Yeah,
enjoy most about studying insects, and not getting down to specific epithet, but at least genus of your favorite pollinator?
Oh boy. Okay, so I got to do the pollen. You warned me early on that I would have to actually choose one. It's like choosing your favorite child. It's not easy.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I love about insects is, I love how diverse, um, resilient and resistant they are, and creative. Like, they're just, you throw any sort of environment in an insect, and they're like, yeah, we can figure this out. I mean, albeit they've been around for a long time, so it's not exactly fair to compare them with mammals, but they're always amazing. I mean, one of the things is, I always tell my students too, is that, like, for all the mass extinctions except the first one, insects have not been affected. They just sort of just keep doing their thing. And I think that's something I really admire about them. And then my favorite pollinator, I really like Spirea dahlia, which is a common name. I was trying to remember. Spirea dahlia, the regal fritillary. Yes, look that up. Yes, it is a tallgrass prairie specialist. A beautiful bug. It's one of my favorites. So it's a butterfly. You probably figured that would happen, but there's so many cool silkworm moths. I like the big fuzzy ones, and so they're pretty cool too. I had a hard time making this talk actually picking out the photos for Saturniids, for the silkworm moths, because I just went down a rabbit hole and couldn't decide. So
I've come to really like Hairstreak butterflies in the past year.
Oh,
They're so
yeah.
cute, and they're like the little fuzzy, chubby. Ugh, I love them. And I think, in terms of pollinator effectiveness, we kind of went through, there's only so many bats. So my second, I think, would be moths. They're just same
Okay.
thing, kind of the fuzzy, just adorable.
Yeah. No, moths have definitely personality. So yeah, they're super. They're great.
I love the photo you had in the slide with the one little peeking little bird.
I know, and
Cute
the
little face.
giant fuzzy face.
They're so cute. All right. Well, I'll give a couple minutes or a minute or two while I'm closing out, if anyone has last minute questions to put in the chat. But Katie, it's been absolutely wonderful hearing from you. Great information. Thank you so much. And like I said, I've placed links in the chat for more information about EcoFlora, our EcoQuest this month, and also the events that we have on Eventbrite. We've got one more in-person event this month. We'll be doing a moth lighting at Evelyn Hallman Park near Desert Botanical Garden on June 29th. And if you aren't already, please follow us along on social media at EcoFloraPHX, and we'll be posting about pollinators all month long. And I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I think that's it. Thank you again, Katie. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the invitation. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. So everyone have a wonderful evening and stay cool out there as best you can.
Yeah, and go find those nocturnal pollinators.
Please.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
See
Have a
you.
great night.
Bye bye.